He knew what no one else could bear to know. He was the only one who knew what the letter contained, and that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through everything he had believed about laughter, about purpose, about the price of seeing too clearly. The weight of it pressed against his ribs with each breath, transforming even the simple act of breathing into a constant reminder of what he now carried alone. Every heartbeat seemed to echo the terrible words he had read, words that would reshape the world once they were spoken aloud. The celebration continued behind him without pause, without awareness, without the slightest tremor of premonition. Voices rose and fell in practiced merriment, feet moved across polished floors in familiar patterns, and wine flowed as freely as it had for decades past. The court had perfected the art of festivity, turning joy into a performance so seamless that even the performers began to believe in their own happiness. Musicians played melodies that had echoed through these halls for generations, each note a thread in the fabric of a world that no longer existed, though they did not yet know it. Laughter bubbled up from conversations that would soon seem impossibly naive, from plans that would never come to fruition, from dreams that were already dying in the ink of a letter only he had read. But he remained seated in his carved chair, motionless as a figure trapped in amber, while the red silk of his costume caught the flickering candlelight. The fabric that had once felt like armor now felt like a shroud, heavy with the weight of what he could no longer pretend not to understand. Each fold seemed to hold shadows that had not been there before, as if the very threads had absorbed the darkness of his knowledge. The bells on his costume, once bright with movement and sound, hung silent now, as if they too understood that the time for joy had passed, even though the celebration around him continued with desperate, unknowing vigor. The letter had arrived that morning, carried by a messenger whose hands trembled as he delivered it, whose eyes held the haunted look of a man who had read something he wished he could forget. No one else had noticed the messenger's fear, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, the urgency disguised as routine. The man had left quickly, too quickly, as if afraid that staying might somehow make him complicit in what the letter revealed, as if proximity to such knowledge might contaminate him with its terrible burden. But then, no one else was paid to notice what others preferred to ignore. No one else had spent 30 years learning to read the signs that others missed or chose not to see. For 30 years he had served this court with bells and riddles, with carefully crafted jokes that revealed uncomfortable truths while allowing their audience to laugh them away. He had learned to hide wisdom behind foolishness, to speak the unspeakable by making it seem harmless, to deliver bitter medicine wrapped in sweet honey so that it might be swallowed without resistance. It was a delicate balance, one that required him to walk the narrow line between revelation and entertainment, between truth and tolerance. Each performance had been a careful calibration of exactly how much reality the audience could bear, how much truth could be spoken without breaking the spell of comfort they so desperately needed to maintain. The letter changed everything. The news it carried was not something that could be softened with humor or disguised behind theatrical gestures. It was raw truth, unforgiving and absolute, the kind that destroyed kingdoms and reshaped the world overnight without regard for the small human lives caught in its wake. And he was the only one who knew. The messenger had been explicit in his instructions. This knowledge was meant for him alone, a burden that could not be shared without consequences, that would ripple far beyond these walls, far beyond this moment, into a future that was already being written in blood and sorrow, somewhere distant from this warm, bright room full of laughter. He had always understood that knowledge was a burden, but he had never fully grasped how crushing that burden could become when it settled into your bones and made itself at home in your soul. Every joke he had ever told, every moment of clarity he had provided wrapped in laughter, had prepared him for this moment when clarity became unbearable, when seeing clearly meant seeing things that no human heart was meant to hold. The years of training himself to see what others missed had culminated in this terrible privilege of seeing something he wished desperately to unsee, of knowing something that made all previous knowledge seem like childish games. The others continued their celebration because they still lived in yesterday's world, where problems could be solved and disasters could be prevented with enough wisdom, enough planning, enough good intentions. They danced and sang because they still believed in tomorrow, in the possibility that careful planning and noble intentions could shape the future according to their will. that human agency still mattered in the face of forces larger than themselves. Their laughter held the confidence of people who believed their choices still mattered, that their actions could alter the course of events already set in motion by powers they could neither see nor comprehend. But the future had already been written, and its ink was dry, sealed with wax that would never melt again. The letter made that clear with brutal efficiency, spelling out in precise official language the death of everything they thought they knew about their world. All the merriment, all the planning, all the hopes that filled the room behind him had become relics the moment the messenger's seal was broken. The decisions that would reshape everything had been made by people far from this place, people who would never know the names or faces of those their choices would destroy, people for whom the lives in this room were nothing more than numbers on a ledger, casualties acceptable in service of some greater game. He could have stood up, walked to the center of the room, and announced what he knew. He could have shattered their illusions with a single sentence, ended their celebration with the weight of truth spoken plain and unadorned. The words formed themselves in his mind, each one sharp and precise, capable of cutting through the music and laughter with surgical precision, of reducing all this joy to silence and tears in the space of a heartbeat. But that was not his role, had never been his role, would never be his role, no matter how heavy the burden of silence became. A jester's purpose was not to destroy joy, but to prepare people for its absence, not to announce disaster, but to help others develop the strength to face it when it arrived uninvited at their door. For 3 decades, he had been teaching them how to laugh in the face of uncertainty, how to find humor in the absurd, how to maintain grace when grace became impossible, how to bend without breaking when the world insisted on bending them. Every performance had been preparation, though he had not known it at the time, though he had thought himself merely an entertainer when he was actually a teacher preparing his students for the hardest lesson of all. Now he understood that every joke had been a lesson, every moment of laughter a form of preparation for this moment when laughter would be needed most. He had been training them without knowing it, giving them tools they would need when the celebration finally ended, and reality demanded its due. The riddles had taught them to think beyond surface appearances, to look for meaning in what seemed meaningless. The gentle mockery of power had shown them that even the mightiest could fall, that nothing in this world was permanent or safe from change. The absurd scenarios he had painted had prepared them to accept the impossible, to find their footing when the ground of certainty shifted beneath their feet. The knowledge would spread eventually. Truth had its own momentum, its own inevitable path from secret to whisper to shout, its own way of breaking free from whatever chains of silence tried to bind it. But for now, in this suspended moment between ignorance and understanding, he could give them one last gift of unknowing joy. He could preserve this final evening of a world where their children's futures still seemed secure, where their plans still held meaning, where hope was not yet a luxury they could not afford. He could hold back tomorrow for just a little longer, let them finish their dance before the music stopped forever. So he remained seated, a silent guardian of their final hours of happiness, holding the weight of tomorrow so they could finish dancing in today. The red silk around him had become heavier than any crown, more burdensome than any scepter, more crushing than any throne. The bells at his collar had fallen silent, and his hands rested motionless in his lap, no longer capable of the gestures that had once punctuated his performances with such lively grace. Even his breathing had become careful, measured, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile bubble of time he was protecting with his silence. The painting would remember this moment long after history had recorded what came next, long after the celebrations ended and the terrible news spread like wildfire through the kingdom and beyond. It would preserve not the celebration or the catastrophe, but the space between them, the precious suspended moment where one man chose to carry the burden of knowledge alone, rather than destroy the last perfect evening of a world that was already ending. In the stillness of oil and canvas, he would sit forever at the threshold between two worlds, guardian of a silence more profound than any words he had ever spoken, keeper of the last moment when laughter was still possible in a world about to forget how to smile.